All right, welcome back to Guy Problems. I'm Alex Malin, and I'm joined by Azizeh Chamani, and she is a fellow therapist, and I've gotten to know her work pretty well. We've done supervision together and for a while now, and I'm privileged to know her. She's a wonderful therapist. And I want to ask you, because you've done a lot of work with men, how did you first start working with men? I know it's not necessarily a specialty, but I know you've worked a lot with men. So I'm curious how that began and what that's been like.
Yeah, so I first started off doing court-mandated therapy for anger management. So essentially anyone who the court deemed had too much of anger problems was sent my way, and we went through like a protocol of kind of learning how to regulate their emotions more. It was an interesting dynamic, especially being a fresh new therapist at the time. A lot of intimidating older men. But thankfully getting thrown into that deep end helped me a lot later on. So from there I went to working with active duty military members, a lot of veterans that had PTSD, and their family members. And from there, got more and more warmed up to work with violent men, offenders, a lot of domestic violence, and narcissism, all the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
Were there any themes that you recognize as like what's a lot of the core reasoning behind some of this anger for men? Have you noticed any patterns? Have you noticed where a lot of the anger stems from?
Yeah, I want to say that a really common thread is this feeling of inferiority. So a lot of shame around not being good enough. And that's formed through, a lot that happens in childhood. As therapists, we're always looking at kind of those childhood wounds. And a lot of times it's the absence of a father figure, trying to overcompensate by adopting these really exaggerated behaviors.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity, exactly. So trying to assert dominance, aggression, and really find that sense of self-worth within the confines of that toxic masculinity.
So toxic masculinity is real.
It's very real.
Yeah,
it is.
And a lot of these men, as they grew violent, I mean, what did you see? How did it affect their lives?
Well, how did it affect their lives?
Like, there's a lot of consequences that come with violence, but I guess, let me rephrase the question. A lot of these men, because was it only men that you saw, or was it anyone in anger management, and it just so happened the majority were men?
It's a good question. They were all men, and it was just supposed to be anger management. So
what do you make of that?
What I make of that is that men don't necessarily learn that other emotions are valid to express, like sadness. There's a lot of shame around being vulnerable, around being sad. And anger is a secondary emotion. So we have what's called the anger iceberg that I know you're familiar with. And anger is essentially that piece of ice that's above water. And underneath the water, the rest of that iceberg is sadness, shame, fear. All the emotions that they learn aren't acceptable. And so it manifests as anger, and it comes out as anger. So in therapy, when we start to address what that anger is really about, it's all of those other emotions that they didn't learn were acceptable. And so a common theme is that there's a lot of shame around vulnerability. There's a lot of stigma. And that essentially is being formed by their models of masculinity.
How do you work through that with them? How do you bring out those other layers of the iceberg?
Well, first through just making it a normalized topic. You know, like we're here to really get into this, and it's a safe space where you can let down those defenses and dig deep, you know? So the first thing we have to do is really establish that safe therapeutic environment. There's no judgment here, and you can really show who you are. So I know we've talked about this in supervision before, but I'm really talking to like the little boy, not the grown man sitting in front of me, right? So every man, even the most stoic, seemingly strong and emotionless man you can think of, deals with the same emotional experiences that everyone else does, but they're not often afforded the same grace and compassion to show those emotions. So it gets stuffed down, it gets suppressed. And, you know, that boiling pot has to blow over at some point, right? So it comes out as anger because anger is acceptable. Anger is manly. And with a lot of people, that goes too far, and that comes out as aggression and violence.
I'm curious, as a woman, your point of view of because men, yes, that's manly, but so how do women or anyone that is attracted to men, some of that is a turn on. So how do you navigate masculinity from the lens of like what's appropriate and what is, I guess, the stereotype of from an attraction standpoint of how do you dig deeper within that of, I don't know how to formulate this question.
Do you mean like when is it too much?
Yeah, like I guess what do you see systemically as the bigger issue of, because people are attracted to masculine men. Like what if that's someone's thing, but so is that contributing also to men's need to express their anger because they're getting positive validation in other areas of their life for these masculine behaviors? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
Yeah, somewhat. So, I mean, what I'm really taking away from that is that we all play a role and we're all responsible. So if there's this stereotype that women want like a more assertive or dominant man, then men are going to try to meet that, right? In whatever way feels normal or natural to them. But yeah, so women are part of that problem, right?
So what do we do about that? Couples therapy?
Yeah,
like what
couples
happens?
therapy. Well, you know, I'm thinking a lot of how like we're throwing around this word masculinity, and that means something different to every person.
Yeah.
Right. So our template of what masculinity means is formed for each of us, including myself, by whoever was that initial model of a man in your life. So for myself, it was my dad. And my dad happens to be someone who's very in tune with his emotions, very emotional in a good way. And he's like the king of words of affirmation. And he's also this pillar of stability. And he's a provider. So that's my idea of what it means to be masculine. That's what I'm holding men up to. So if someone is really angry and like asserting their dominance in that way, I don't actually define that as masculine at all. So I think that's what we first need to do is define what it means to each person. And then look at, is that a healthy model for themselves? Is that a healthy standard that you're holding yourself up to? It's going to look different for each person. And there's someone for everyone. So someone's going to be attracted to that and someone's not, right? But talking specifically to men, you know, I think they need to ask themselves, is this really the standard I want to have for myself? Is it what society's telling me to do? Is it what my peers and other men are thinking is like the right thing to do, because there's a lot of seeking for male validation within men, and this like inner competition to, you know, one up each other, or, you know, get the most girls. And there's this unhealthy like testosterone race going on.
That's a good way of saying
Yeah.
it. Testosterone race. I like that.
And it's like really fueling a lot of that toxicity.
How do you deal with anger in the room when it presents itself? How do you deal with both from a logistical standpoint? How do you navigate that? But also, how do you deal with your own emotions coming up of discomfort or whatever comes up for you in those moments?
Yeah. So thankfully, the people pleaser in me is able to stuff down a lot of it until I'm out of session. But you know, a lot of what happens in therapy is structured in the sense that there's initial ground rules, right? Like in couples therapy, you initially set rules of if you get elevated, I'm going to ask you to leave, you know? Or if I start noticing that you're getting really activated, I'm going to steer the conversation away from the content and work on bringing you back down, because you're not hearing anything I'm saying, and I'm now feeling unsafe. So no real work is being done here. And if it's not a safe therapeutic space, then what are we doing, right? Thankfully, even the most angry, violent men that I've worked with understand that they're in a therapy room, and they don't direct that at me. There have been instances where I felt a little bit more unsafe, but you know, with those cases, it's like I was saying, bringing them back down, and then using supervision to really work through my own feelings, you know, because that's going to trigger me feeling a little bit more shut down, me, you know, retreating back into my humanness, right? And not being able to do my best work. So kind of supervision is a big part of that.
Yeah. Okay. And what tools would you give to someone to help de-escalate when they see someone getting aggressive or violent? Because you have a gift of de-escalating people and kind of disarming them. So I'm curious, how do you navigate that? And what tools would you give to someone else trying to de-escalate a situation?
Well, I'm thinking a lot of, you know, when say a couple is getting in an argument, and what most people do is they match the energy of the person getting escalated. And so it's ping-ponging back and forth. It's getting worse and worse. And egos come in, and naturally that feeling of wanting to defend yourself comes in. So what we want to do is the opposite. You start to notice someone getting activated, you address that itself. You either take space apart until you can come back down and have a real conversation, or you start kind of tending to what is it that they're getting upset about? Is it that they're not feeling heard? Well, then address that, not the content of the argument. You know, so I don't know how much of this is easy to do in the moment when personal feelings are involved. It's a lot easier to navigate this when you're speaking about it in retrospect, right? But I would say the biggest thing is taking space, you know, doing what you need to do to get back down to a baseline where you're able to have a real conversation.
Yeah. And that could look different for everyone.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Using whatever it takes to regulate yourself so that you could view it from a less elevated standpoint, even if the other person is escalated.
Right. And most people don't know how to regulate their emotions. You know, that's one of the biggest things we do in therapy is learning to get in touch with your body sensations, with your thoughts, with your emotions, noticing the shifts, knowing I'm starting to feel a little bit more hot. My fists are starting to clench. This is a sign to me that I'm getting more activated and angry. This is where I need to insert a coping skill instead of letting it get worse and worse and worse, and then it's even more difficult to address.
How did you become a therapist? I don't even know this story.
Okay.
Like, why did you decide to become a therapist, and how did that go?
Not a super interesting story. I've just always been really interested in understanding the mind and people's emotions and getting to know people on a really deep level. I would say small talk has always been really difficult for me because I just want to deep dive into what's your trauma, like what really made you who you are. And emotionally myself, I've always felt very sensitive to other people's emotions. Like I'm very attuned to what they're going through. So when I found out that a profession existed where I would get to use all of that as a strength, I was over the moon excited. And then specifically, getting involved with psychology, I always found myself gravitating towards the trauma cases, any kind of like recent traumatic event that's really shaken the foundation of a person's life. So I like the more intense stuff because I get bored a little bit more easily with anything else.
How did you begin then working with people with anger or perpetrators of abuse or violence? Like where did that interest stem from? Or was it just happenstance?
It was a little bit of happenstance. Most of my clinical experience was with working with veterans and, active duty military members. And it just so happens that a lot of them had either experienced a lot of childhood abuse where they learned these behaviors or they had to learn them as a defense, So I just by happenstance and like majority of my cases focusing on them, I found myself really getting more and more interested. And I was always worried about that dynamic of like, I'm a younger female therapist and these are mostly men like 30s to 50s. And I always wondered, what is that dynamic going to, like, how is that dynamic going to affect the work that we're doing? Is this kind of like not where I should be? Are they going to not take me seriously? And it actually happened to be the opposite. I found that they felt they were able to let their guard down more because I wasn't threatening to them in any way. So when I experienced that really rewarding piece of seeing the work that was being done and the impact and the progress, it was really motivating to stick with it.
I think in those cases, nurturance is so powerful. So men like that, maybe seeing a male therapist wouldn't be the best thing because of that need to, one up or be masculine. Whereas with a woman therapist like yourself that's super nurturing, it fills this void potentially for them when they were a young man or when you are looking at that young boy who maybe didn't get that nurturance or that ability to feel their feelings. Now it's basically a mother wound in some sort. So you get to play that role to a degree. So I could see how that is so much more effective than seeing a male therapist in those scenarios.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that all of that seems to happen in such an indirect way. Like I don't think they're even aware of it when they come into the room that they're going to be able to let down their defenses more. But because they naturally feel that they're in a more nurturing space, and on top of that, a very confidential space, obviously with therapy, they're able to experience more of that safety. And I find the more maternal parts of myself coming out too, naturally, so it's a little bit tricky. You don't want to get too much into like mothering, and it has to be done in a very discreet way. And what we're really saying when we say mothering or maternal is providing that safety, providing that security where they're able to be themselves.
Now, you mentioned narcissism as well, and that seems to be a buzzword these days. Everyone is describing someone in their life as, oh, they're a narcissist, or, I see a lot more of it now than I used to. So How do you navigate working with narcissistic men or narcissistic women, anyone that's narcissistic? Because I know
Yeah.
that you've done that. You mentioned it, and that tends to be a tricky one. So I'm
Yeah,
curious how you approach that and what that's been like.
it does. Yeah. Well, first, I want to say that that word gets thrown around way too much.
Agreed.
Not everyone is a narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
People just have egos.
Mm-hmm.
And real narcissism is very difficult to confront because most of these people don't think they have a problem at all. It's a lot easier to work with someone who recognizes that whatever they're going through, or like whatever mood disorder or personality disorder they might have, is negatively affecting their life. But with narcissism, they think everybody else is the problem. So it's really difficult to confront the role that they play in their own suffering without damaging their ego so much that they don't even come back. So it has to be done a lot more slowly, a lot more discreetly, just every once in a while poking at it.
Okay.
But I would say that the biggest thing that I've noticed is this sense of entitlement, right? This sense of everybody else is the problem. It's not me. And I want to just complain about it. And as the therapist, it can get, kind of frustrating at times
No doubt.
when you're trying to go about it in all these different ways and help them see the role they're playing, and they just don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
Right.
Deflecting and
Deflecting.
defensiveness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it feel like a game a little bit for you? Not a fun game, but a
Right.
game nonetheless of I need to appease them a little bit so that so that I can eventually hold up the mirror. Because if I don't
Yes.
appease them, then they are just going to turn away
Right.
and not listen to anything I have to say. But if I give them a little bit, then I could hold the mirror up because I've earned enough trust.
Right. And this is where that therapeutic relationship really comes in, because they have to essentially decide that I'm someone worth opening up to. Right. Why should they take me seriously? Why should they hear a single thing that I have to say? So they can really easily put me in that category of, you're just another person who doesn't get it or isn't good enough to understand me. So you have to really build that bond. And at times, like let them win some of the battles, right? But essentially, I would say the results come in a lot later with them. Like you have to really hold up that mirror of, this is the pattern that you're experiencing in your life, and show them these are the people, these are the situations that have all given you the same result and outcome. And if you're not the problem, if you're not doing anything wrong, then why is this happening? And really come at it in a gentle way, in a very gentle but still confronting way, to say, you're not going to get different results unless you do something differently.
And what have you seen as a big cause of narcissism in a lot? Is there any sort of pattern as to what has caused that? Is it genetic? Is it? I have my own take on it, but I'm curious to hear yours.
I have seen a lot of people who have narcissistic tendencies also have a parent who was narcissistic. So I think some of it is learned. Specifically in my experience, a lot of it has been, this was the kid that was always overlooked. Nothing was about them. They genuinely were neglected in a lot of ways. So they learned as a defense to make everything about themselves. And narcissism is this wound. And these are some of the most hurt people. And they really feel like nobody cares about them.
I couldn't agree more. I'm curious, do you feel as though they can get better? Because sometimes I feel, in my experience, and maybe I just haven't dug deep enough, but there's times I feel the defenses are too big. The defenses are insurmountable, where the wound is so deep
Yeah.
that poking that hole, as you said, they are incapable of allowing that. Maybe I haven't earned the trust enough to do that, but have you ever found that they're so mistrusting of others that it's just impossible at that point to poke?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I want to say I haven't seen a tremendous amount of growth like away from that narcissistic label. People don't stick around in therapy for the longest amount of time when they're really narcissistic. So I think that some work can be done. They can start to see some of the issues, but ultimately it's too confronting to realize that your entire, template of how you see the world is so wrong. So it's easier to just keep doing things the same way and to say, I'm going to instead have shorter relationships or go job from job and change my environment instead of change myself.
And what do you do when you feel as though it's getting incredibly stagnant, where you aren't seeing the growth? How do you keep showing up in those moments?
It's hard. Yeah, actually our supervisor, Ella, has helped me a lot with that, of bringing it into the here and now and having more of a conversation of really collaboratively talking about it and saying, hey, here's the work that we've done. I've seen great progress in these areas, but there's something deeper here that we're really not getting at or really poking at deeply enough. And I'm wondering if you're also having this feeling of like we're going in a cycle, we're not really addressing these deeper things.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is enough to go a little bit deeper where they'll say, yeah, I feel like we're kind of talking about the same thing multiple weeks in a row. And, this is ultimately someone who's choosing to be in therapy, who's choosing to show up, give their time, give their money. So it's worth making the conversation about, is this a useful way for you to be spending this time? And if they say no, well, what are we going to do about that? So it kind of puts the responsibility back on them, which is really helpful to us. And I think that we forget a lot of times that we can put it back on them and not take on all the work.
Yeah. So being authentic and just sharing what you're seeing with them, at least you can collaborate to have an open discussion around it.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So obviously you've done a lot of work with men, but what are you gravitating towards now? Is it still that part of the field? Is it more trauma related? I know you are EMDR trained.
Yeah.
What are you leaning towards, or what are you gravitating towards most at this point?
Definitely more of the intense stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So still the intense stuff.
Yeah.
You haven't lost your appetite for that.
No, not yet. I definitely gravitate the most towards PTSD. I'm actually getting more interested in working with, survivors of like a recent traumatic event, like if they've just witnessed a death or something else violent. So really trying to get in there like as soon as possible and address what they've seen or experienced before it becomes this deeper wound. With domestic violence, I'm really enjoying working with, survivors, and also with some of my more recent experiences, actually working with the person who's been on the violent or like intimidating end and kind of addressing their mindset a little bit more of like, how did you get here? Do you even realize that you've, done something wrong? Or is it so pushed down in their psyche of like, this is the right way to be? Coming back to where we started in this conversation of, is this just what it means to be masculine, that you don't even realize there's something to change?
It's so interesting. It takes such a particular person to be able to do that effectively, to be assertive enough to call these people out on their shit, but also gentle and nurturing enough to be able to help them heal. And I don't know how you find that balance, but you do it so beautifully. I definitely haven't found that balance to the level I'd like. So it's incredibly inspiring to see.
Thank you.
But how did you find, is it just a natural gift? Is it something you've worked on? How do you blend that people-pleasing side of you that is trying to appease with assertiveness and the ability to call people out when you see something that they need to be, the mirror needs to be held up? How do you do that?
Well, first off, I want to say, for yourself as a male therapist, it's just such a different experience that I don't think you should be comparing at all, right?
I'm not comparing that. I'm comparing the ability to balance gentleness and assertiveness.
Okay.
I have male friends that are able to do that as well, and it's something I'm envious of because sometimes I come in a little too hot, and sometimes I think I'm a little too soft, where I need to be more assertive. Right. So it's something, I mean, I have my own past that contributes to that, but when I see people that blend that so well, that is a tool and a gift and a communication style that I am so envious of because that's what I aspire to.
Yeah. Well, I want to say that the soft, more gentle side, that's just naturally who I am. So I'm not putting in any effort there. What I'm intentionally trying to do is be more assertive, and none of that comes naturally to me. So what I've really had to do is be in those situations where the only option is to be assertive, to get anywhere, to not be a doormat. So it's forced me to bring out that side of me.
Yeah.
But it's not comfortable. It's draining, but it is effective. And I think it's been really helpful to see the positive effect of that and to try and bring that more into my personal life too, right?
It's interesting, just the dynamic of you as a woman, me as a man, as therapists. I think when I am assertive sometimes, then I'm feeding the stereotype of an angry man or aggressive, even when I'm not intending to be, even if it's not necessarily in the tone of my voice.
Right.
There's times where I am maybe around a woman and I feel myself trying to make myself smaller to signal to her that I'm non-threatening. Right. So I think that aspect of it, it's just an interesting thing to look at where your assertiveness, just by nature, you could probably take it a little further without any sign that there's a threat to that same degree.
Right.
I don't know. It's an interesting observation I just had as you were talking about that.
Yeah. And really, as you were bringing that up, I was picturing a lot of the different men and how they actually do shift their body language a lot of times in session. I don't think it's on purpose, but to kind of show that they're not in their like assertive, dominant mindset right now. They might like shrink away a little bit or relax a little bit more. And that helps me, obviously, because we're not always talking about the easiest topics. And I'm still a person in the room. And even though I know this person is not a threat to me, internally, I have my past too. I have my own personal experiences, which are going to affect whether I feel comfortable enough to say what I need to say.
in your personal life, how do you navigate your own emotions in terms of coping with difficult situations? Because in the time that I've gotten to know you a bit, you come in so balanced, even when you seem stressed. I think you are good at taking care of yourself from what I can tell.
Yeah.
So how do you do that for people that are experiencing anxiety or stress or just any real obstacle in their life? You just seem like you navigate that really well.
Thank you. It's very intentional. So I do a lot of journaling. I write like pages every day, and that's really how I process seeing these clients, and really like decluttering my mind of everything that's going on. Morning routines and night routines are the most important thing to me and what make me feel grounded. So I start off every day setting my intention, moving my body, whether it's like a little walk or going to the gym, wherever I can fit that into my day. I always try to do it before starting the workday to really feel like my energy's balanced out. There's nothing on my mind that's going to affect the work that we do with these clients. As far as like leaving sessions, I take that car ride to really like sing my heart out to a song, call a friend, do whatever I need to do to stabilize again, and because I don't carry it around. I get it out. I have my feelings about it. And with going to sleep at night, because I've noticed really difficult cases affect my dreams a lot, affect whether I get a good night of sleep or not. So I focus a lot on like sensory deprivation, like being in a dark room, taking a shower in the dark, using essential oils. Like for me, I'm very sensitive to my senses. So I do any kind of coping skill that really addresses calming myself in those ways.
How did you gain so much insight into yourself? Was it through your own therapy? Have you always just been intentional around who you are and exploring that part of yourself? Was that encouraged as a kid?
I wouldn't say it was encouraged or discouraged. I've always just been very introspective, and I love understanding myself as much as I love understanding other people. So it's honestly fun to take care of myself. It's necessary. I don't think self-care should ever be an afterthought. It should be a priority to be our best self. And I'm just always looking for new ways to, make myself feel more balanced, to be the best person that I can be.
How do you deal with the new generation in terms of like social media, AI? Like, there's a lot of noise out there. So how do you limit that and avoid, because it's part of our world, but how do you not let it infiltrate your personal space, your personal well-being?
Do you mean like all the talk about mental health?
I mean more like comparisons and getting caught up in like dating apps and I'm not sure if you're on those or not, but I'm just saying like the world is ever changing, technology is ever changing. There's a lot of noise out there. How do you, it could be very I guess anxiety provoking. How do you not allow that to get to you?
Well, with social media, I feel like, because the same way we were just talking about narcissism, there are certain words that get thrown around so much now. And especially with the TikTok generation, everyone thinks they're an expert on everything. And sometimes there's good information being spread, but a lot of it is misinformation. And it's frustrating to see everyone buying into it just because it's obviously the most accessible way to learn and to gain information. So, I try to limit my exposure or like my consumption to that media, But, I still enjoy TikTok. I still enjoy the dating apps. So I just try to filter out,
I was just going to ask you, how do you filter out like good information from misinformation?
you mean as far as like the psychology topics?
Yeah, like what people are saying out there about the world and about mental health and about just overall well-being. How do you filter out what's good advice and just harmful advice like toxic masculinity? There's a lot of people that push that. So how do you filter out what you feel is beneficial versus, negative perpetuating ideas?
Well, I always like to look at the source, like do a little bit, even just the most basic background check of who is this person, spreading this information. Is it someone who just wants a platform to spread their own ideas and has gained a following? Or is it someone who actually has some level of knowledge on this topic? And also, what's their intention? Are they trying to teach other people? Are they trying to help other people? Or do they just want to hear themselves talk, right?
Yeah. There seems to be a lot of that today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to thank you for joining me today. It has been your knowledge. I'd love to have you on again another time. I think your knowledge in the field of psychology is, as I said before, inspiring. I appreciate the opportunity to get to know you more, and I'm thankful that I've gotten to know you. So thank you for joining me today.